According to the Geological Survey, 1,151 earthquakes happened in the last month across the world, with a magnitude of 2.5 and up. All across the world, and not just in America, the lives of many are shaken by this natural disaster. Many stories are publicized on how people have lost their loved ones, their property, and all their earthly possessions. Now, this sermon is not going to be about a natural disaster or earthquakes, but rather a spiritual earthquake, particularly mine. Today's sermon will be a short and with a simple message, and I hope you will be blessed by it. After experiencing this particular situation, I realized that I was associating myself quite frequently with the life of Job. With that said, I will be sharing my testimony in 3 parts and with 3 components. I know some of you, if not all, are ending their classes. Congratulations to Mel and Rachel yesterday for graduating, and Dr. Ernest Kim, who defended his thesis. And if you're like me at the beginning of any class, I'd like to look at the syllabus and see what's coming up ahead. So I will be using the earthquake as a symbol, and part 1 will be the initial shock, part 2 the aftershock, and part 3 the aftermath. And to break that down a little more, in each part there will be an earthquake component, the life of Job component, and a my life component. Now, how do you know an earthquake is coming? Sure, there can be predictions on how big the magnitude will be, but can you physically predict what will happen? Can you guess which homes will be affected, whose lives it will affect? No, we can simply predict and prepare for the worst earthquake of our lives, but we will never know the full effects until it happens to us. Now, I know all of us that know the story of Job from the Bible, but let's turn there now to Job 1. I hope you brought your Bibles. If not, I have conveniently put it up on the PowerPoint. Job 1, starting with verse 1 to 5. I know it's a little small, I'm sorry. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. And there was born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels, and 5,000 yoke of oxen and 500 she-asses, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the east. And his sons went and feasted in their houses every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And it was so, when the days of the feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. Reading these verses, we know that Job was very blessed. He had a lot of kids, he had a lot of animals, and I'm sure he had a big house, and a lot of people envied him. But at this point of the story, did Job know that he would be tested? Did Job know that he would experience an earthquake? Would he have been better prepared if he knew that he was going to have one? Now, some of these questions we can't answer, but what we know is that he lost everything, literally. According to a government website, when asked if earthquakes can be predicted, they say no, and it is unlikely that they will ever be able to predict them. Scientists have tried many different ways of predicting earthquakes, but none have been successful. On any particular fault, scientists know there will be another earthquake sometime in the future, but they have no idea of telling when it will happen. Just like the many physical earthquakes we are faced with in this country, just like Job's earthquake, our spiritual earthquakes are not forewarned or known in advance. In Education, page 56, it reads, according to his faith, so was it unto Job. When he hath tried me, he said, I shall come forth as gold. So it came to pass, by his patient endurance, Job vindicated his own character, and thus the character of him whose representative he was. One lesson we can learn from Job at this point is that even though Job did not know he would experience an earthquake, his faith was grounded in the Lord, and nothing could deter him from serving God. Do we have Job's faith that when we are tested, we can say, I shall come forth as gold? Now, as most of you know, I had cancer when I was 17, and because of that experience, I chose to go into the field of nursing. I remember specifically asking a pastor from GYC in 2008, how do I know what God's will is for my life? How do I know that God is speaking to me? And I thought I figured it out. I started doing my prereqs for nursing. It took about 2 years, and after that, I applied to all the community colleges in Washington, gotten into all of them. I applied to Loma Linda, also got in there. But my heart was set on going to UW. I applied the first time. I didn't get in, but I prayed the prayer of Psalms 37:4, where it says, take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Sorry, I'm sweating. Both my sisters went there, and they were known for having a great nursing school. I had applied the first time, I didn't get in, but I applied the second time with more hours of volunteering and more working hours, and I had gotten in. Life was good again. This was 2011, and I was ready to start my nursing school career. I did just fine that first quarter, and as winter quarter was about to start, I would have clinicals at Seattle Children's Hospital. This was the same hospital where I had gotten some of my medical treatment and where I did some volunteering. This was where I wanted to be. This was where I was meant to be. Before nursing school, I had it in my heart that I would graduate and work at Seattle Children's. I was excited to start my clinicals there, but as you would know it, this is where my earthquake happened. The orientation for Children's was on a Saturday. It would be a whole day event, and it was mandatory, meaning that there was no exceptions. Every person would have to be there. This happened in January, right after GYC, and I came back with a post-GYC high. I was convinced not to go. So I consulted the person who was in charge of clinical placements, and when I went to her, she said, this orientation is mandatory. If you choose not to attend, you cannot attend clinicals, you can't continue in your coursework, and this would hold you back 1 year. And you would start again next winter quarter in January. As you can imagine, I was very upset, I was mad, and I was determined to fight. I asked if there was anything else I could do, a different orientation day, or making it up another time, at home, or I wanted to find somebody at Children's that I could speak to convince them to let me do the orientation another time. I had worked so hard, and I had my mindset on working at Seattle Children's, the place where I was meant to be, but it seemed like they didn't want me. This was 1 week before the orientation, and I talked to my parents, family, and friends. I remember making a phone call to Ian and just crying my eyes out because this was one of the hardest choices that I've had to make. Do I sacrifice 8 hours of a Sabbath day in pursuit of my education and career? Or do I keep the Sabbath holy? I know what you're thinking. Objectively, there was no other choice to make. The obvious choice was to not go. But for me, there was a personal struggle between the spiritual and the carnal. E.G. White writes in Steps to Christ, page 47, many are inquiring. I have replaced all the you and yours into me and mine. Many are inquiring, how am I to surrender of myself to God? I desire to give myself to him, but I am weak in moral power, in slavery to doubt, and controlled by the habits of my life of sin. My promises and resolutions are like ropes of sand. I cannot control my thoughts, my impulses, my affections. The knowledge of my broken promises and forfeited pledges weakens my confidence in my own sincerity and causes me to feel that God cannot accept me. But I need not despair. What I need to understand is the true force of the will. This is the governing power in the nature of man, the power of decision or of choice. Everything depends on the right action of the will. The power of choice God has given to men. It is theirs to exercise. I cannot change my heart. I cannot of myself give to God its affections, but I can choose to serve him. I can give him my all. He will then work in me to will and to do according to his good pleasure. Thus my whole nature will be brought under the control of the Spirit of Christ. My affections will be centered upon him. My thoughts will be in harmony with him. I felt that E.G. White had written this just for me, a reminder that we, me included, are weak and frail human beings. In my heart, I wanted to go to that orientation. To think about it, it was 8 hours versus a whole year. As a human being, I knew what I wanted to do, but was this in accordance of what he wanted me to do? At times we are faced with a crossroads. One leads down this path and another path. At this point in my life, I had a lot of doubt that God would deliver. I knew the promises in the Bible, and yet there was still this battle. While talking to my peers and family, I had one common theme. They said, "You know what you have to do, and no one else can make the decision for you." But two people closest to me said, "Are you really willing to sacrifice 1 year for 8 hours?" And in short, they wanted me to go to that orientation. I was shocked. How could they say that to me? Let's turn to Job 2, verse 9 and 10. Then said Job's wife unto him, "Dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die." But he said unto her, "Thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaks. What, shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this did not Job sin with his lips. I can associate myself with Job at this point. Do you think that Job loved his wife? Do you think that Job's wife loved him? Or did it seem like, did she love Job, the things that Job possessed more? Or do you think she loved God? At this point, it seemed like I had to choose between my family or God. He had then told me a verse found in 1 Samuel 2:30. But now the Lord said, "Be it far from me, for them that honor me I will honor, and they that despise me shall be lightly esteemed." Also another verse found in Psalms 27:10 says, "Although my father and mother, or whoever it may be that is closest to you, desert me, the Lord will take care of me." How wonderful is that promise? These verses I clung to with my life, my future, and these same verses made my choice that much easier. A few days before the orientation, I showed up at my advisor's office with 2 blows in my hand. One about the Sabbath day and one that I don't remember now. I ended up not going to that orientation, and because of those 8 hours, I had to wait another year to continue my education. David Asher says this in one of his sermons, "The choices we make today create the person we will be tomorrow, and we have no guarantee that the person we will be tomorrow will even be capable of making the moral choices we are faced with today." And on a related note, Hebrews 3:15 says, "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the provocation." Do you agree that the person you are today are because of the choices you made yesterday? As I recently mentioned, a part of me wanted to go, but thinking about it now, would I be the same person if I had gone to that orientation? I can play the what-if game, but God convicted me, and when God convicts you, I want to plead with you to not ignore that voice. When you are in a spiritual conflict or dilemma, remember to choose God that day, that hour, that moment. You are not promised a second chance to make that choice again, and the next time it happens, you may make the wrong decision. In Luke 16, verse 10, it says, "Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much." Although my decision or the decision that you have to make may seem minuscule or a small decision, make that choice because God is building up our character so He can trust us with bigger things. During this time, I kept in contact with the person in charge of clinicals and to see if it was even possible for me to come back the next year. I asked her and she said, I asked her, will this happen again next year? And she said, yes. The orientation has always been on a Saturday, and it always will be on a Saturday. There are no plans on changing that date, but I will keep you updated, she said. So I went with the didactic courses that I could take, and I remember in spring quarter, a person from Seattle Children's came and spoke to our class. After the class, I met up with her and I told her about my experience and I asked her if the date will ever be changed. She replied, nobody wants it on a Saturday, but it is the only time that everybody could go and is available. We are working on changing it, but I cannot guarantee that it will change by next year, but it might, she said. I never thought the word might or maybe could be so comforting, but it did. Around this time, winter and spring quarter, I started to look at other schools. I needed to find a school that would take the courses that I've already taken in nursing school and one that would not conflict with the Sabbath day. I started looking at the local schools and 2 schools matched my criteria. One was Seattle Pacific University and one is Washington State University. While doing the application, I was also keeping in touch with a person from UW. By that summertime, it had seemed like all the doors were closing. UW couldn't tell me if the date had been changed, and both the application process for SPU and Wazoo seemed like it came to a dead end. Either I missed a date to turn in something, or my transcript did not get there on time. By the end of the summer, the weight of the world was on my shoulders. I had no plans on going back to UW, and I had nowhere else to go. January was coming up again, and for all I knew, I would not be a student anymore. But it had seemed that God had closed Wazoo and SPU for a reason. In October, I talked to my clinical instructor again, and praise the Lord, the orientation was changed from a Saturday to a Wednesday. That same person who told me that it had always been and will be on a Saturday was wrong. The Lord is good, and if it came to that point again, I knew that I would be pressured to go to that orientation, but God prevented me from even having to make that decision. In November, I was then given a clinical placement for winter quarter in January, and again I would be at Children's, but this time every other week would be on a Saturday. I saw that email and my heart nearly sank. That same day I wrote back to the clinical placement, and praise the Lord, she was able to switch it the next day, and I would have Swedish that winter quarter and Children's that spring on a Thursday. Sometimes I think that God has a sense of humor. For a second there I thought He had forgotten about me, but He never fails to surprise and bless me. It seemed that life was good again. But by God's grace, I was starting school. The winter quarter flew by and I was ready to start my experience at Children's. As spring quarter came, I attended that orientation, which was on a Wednesday now. And I remember not seeing this person that I knew would have orientation with me. I asked myself, is he going to be able to continue? As we have been using the analogy of an earthquake, the aftershock is defined as an earthquake that is usually smaller than the initial earthquake, but in the same geographical area. I did some digging around, and in trying to find information about this other student, I found my aftershock. I was informed that he was not at the orientation, but he was able to make it up. I learned that he was at a nursing conference and they excused his absence. This made me furious. I wrote a letter to the dean of nursing and they asked to meet with me. During this meeting, they explained that he asked to be excused in advance, something that I did, and he was going to make it up another time, which was something I was willing to do. She also explained that the procedures had changed, that this time the orientation was at UW instead of at Children's, allowing students to make up that missed session more easily. And yet in my heart, I was still distraught. How could this happen? I had resentment towards the system and resentment towards God. It just wasn't fair. If we look at Job 3, he also had a similar experience. The whole chapter is about how he cursed God the day that he was born. I can relate with Job at this point of my experience where he says in verse 26, I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil. I remember praying one night telling God, I followed you, I listened to you, and yet this is what happens? I had no peace from following him. In Job 17:5-6, Job also says, where is my hope? As for my hope, who shall see it? They shall go down to the bars of the pit when our rest together is in the dust. Now I praise God for the Bible and an inspired writing of G.G. White because it seems like they always have an answer for everything. In Prophets and Kings, page 174, it says, when we are encompassed with doubt, perplexed by circumstances, or afflicted by poverty or distress, Satan seeks to shake our confidence in Jehovah. Despondency may shake the most heroic faith and weakens the most steadfast will. But God understands. He still pities and loves. He reads the motives and purposes of the heart, to wait patiently, to trust when everything looks dark, is the lesson that the leaders in God's work need to learn. Heaven will not fail them in their day of adversity. Isn't that just wonderful? In one sentence, God says he understands, he pities, and he loves. If you haven't noticed, there's one common theme throughout my experience, and that was patience. I wanted to go to that orientation, but God said, wait, I have something better. I had resentment towards God, and he said, wait, I will show you why this is happening. I will show you something better. And something better did come. Now, being a part of two cohorts, which means I was in last year's graduating class and this year's graduating class, I got to know a big group of people. In spring quarter, I remember getting on the bus, and I met someone from last year's cohort. Let's call him X. Now, X was a Jewish man. He told me how he heard about what happened to me, and he commended me on standing up for my faith. He then asked me more about Adventism, and at the end of that conversation, he told me how he wished he would have also stood up for his faith, and how he felt guilty for going to that orientation. In 1 Corinthians 4:9, it reads, for I think that God has set forth us the apostles last, as it were appointed to death. For we are made a spectacle unto the world, and to angels, and to men. This verse was the theme verse for GYC last year. And what does it mean to be a spectacle? It says that we are a spectacle. Men and angels are watching us, watching our every move, every choice that we make to the advancement of God's kingdom and to the advancement of Satan's work. I realize that although this experience happened to me, it may not have been for me. It may have been for that teacher who I gave the gloves to, or this Jewish man. This is just one of the many people who have asked me about Adventism because of this experience. God has allowed me to share my experience to many, including professors, clinical instructors, other students, about how God delivered me through that experience. Now, going back to the earthquake analogy, do you think that when a building falls after an earthquake that they would build it the exact same as before the earthquake? No. They will use better materials that can withstand a future earthquake, and one that will be stronger and better in general. Going back to Job, although he had lost everything in the beginning, God blessed him even more at the end. Let's turn to Job 42, starting in verse 12. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. And he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. The first daughter he named Jemima, the second Keziah, and the third Karen. Nor in the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters. And their father granted them an inheritance along with their brothers. After this, Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the 4th generation, and so Job died, an old man and full of years. And just as he blessed Job, so he did with me. This past summer, I was in California. I was able to be at the birth of my nephew, and while I was there, I applied for a nursing technician job here at Harbor View, where Gina works. And the day after I applied, I called the recruiter, got an interview for a few weeks later, and I was hired on the spot at that interview. Also, this past year, I was enrolled in the honors program where I did research on post-stroke fatigue with a researcher that is quite well known at UW's nursing program. This is the same honors program that had been on hold the year before because it did not have enough funding. So if I had graduated a year earlier, this would not have been an option for me. God knew the opportunities that I would have if I had waited another year to continue my education. A quote found in the book I Kissed Dating Goodbye by Joshua Harris reads as follows. Waiting for God's timing requires trusting in God's goodness. We develop patience as we trust that God denies us good things in the present only because he has something better for us in the future. This was a hard lesson for me to learn. Up until nursing school, I felt that God was leading me, and it was a smooth ride. But in all of this, God has taught me the valuable lesson in patience and what we can learn through trials. Now, a story is told of a man named Charles Blondin. Betty kind of shared about this last week in Sabbath school. He was called the Great Blondin. He was well known because he was a French acrobat, and his niche was performing on a tightrope. But his greatest feat was for walking the tightrope across the Niagara Falls. The rope was about half a mile long and 160 feet above water. The first time he went across, he used a balance beam to hold him steady. The second time, he used stilts. The third time, he carried a wheelbarrow. And time again, he would bring something with him that was more heavy, more challenging, and even more daring. There would often be a huge crowd gathering around him before he went on his journey. There were various stories to illustrate this point, but there was many stories to illustrate this point, but at one point he asked the crowd, how many of you believe that I could carry a man safely across the Niagara Falls? And everybody said, yes, I believe, I believe, I believe. But there was one man who said it really loud, ecstatically. He was like, I believe. And so Blondin said to this man, well, let's go, let's get on my back and we'll go across. This man simply refused and he disappeared into the mass of people. On a different occasion, someone had finally said yes. He was unable to carry that man on his back, and they made it across safely to the other side of the Niagara Falls. Now, which man are you? The one that simply says, I believe, and acts on that faith? Or are you the man who says, I believe, and falls when you are act on that faith? Now, as I have said, spiritual earthquakes are inevitable, but God reminds us in Deuteronomy 31:6, where it says, be strong and of good courage. Fear not, nor be afraid of them. For the Lord thy God, He it is that doth go with thee. He will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. A reminder that if you act on faith, He will do just that. He will carry you through the other side, to the other side. Another fact about earthquakes is that it does not discriminate. It doesn't discriminate gender, age, whether you have a good job or not, whether you're a millionaire or you're poor. Once the city is hit, all is affected. Now we hear this verse often. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians 10:13. There hath no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. Did God say that you will not be tempted at all? No. In other terms, He says when you are tempted, He will get you through it. Oftentimes, me included, we trust in our own powers and our own sinful nature to overcome a temptation. But this is misguided. As much as I put my human efforts to make up that orientation, He simply allowed that experience to show me who He was and who I was not. He who has overcome the world, who knows the end from the beginning, is the only one who can get us safely to the other side. Will you, like the man who got on Blondin's back, trust Him? Trust God, the only one who can get us to the other side safely? Early this year, I have to admit that my spiritual life had become very stagnant. I had become comfortable in doing the bare minimum. Then someone told me to challenge myself, and not only to challenge myself, but challenge God. This challenge was meant for me to get out of my comfort zone and become a better witness. We all have a testimony of how God delivered us through the hardest of times. Some, like mine, may be small, and some may be bigger, but there is no need to discount the smallest testimonies. All have been from the hand of God. We have all had earthquakes, and my appeal to you today is a simple one. I want you to think of those experiences and ask God to give you the opportunities to share your testimony to the world. The world is dying to know the God of possibilities and miracles. And your testimony may be the only way a person will know of Christ and His love towards His people. To close, I stand before you not boasting of any of my achievements or accomplishments, but rather a testimony of what God has done and is doing in my life, and what He can do in yours if you simply let Him. I mentioned early on that I had wanted to speak specifically on this date. I chose this date because next Friday, a week from yesterday, the Dean of UW School of Nursing will say, will the students of the #1 nursing school in the nation please stand up? I've waited years for this moment, and I hope that you can see how evident God's fingerprint has been in my life. As many of you know, it is with a heavy heart for me to say that I'm leaving Washington. Moving to California in August will be the hardest thing I will have to do. Leaving the mountains, the trees, the weather, and especially this church and its members. I don't know what God has in store for me in my future, but as one of my favorite songs says, many things about tomorrow I don't seem to understand, but I know who holds tomorrow, and I know who holds my hand. Amen.
Praise the Lord for such a powerful testimony. Thank you for God. Will you please stand as we sing our closing song, I'd Rather Have Jesus.